when we say political science. So political science is a two-step process. Step one is use scientific methods to better understand politics. Step two is then be totally ignored by policymakers, voters, and everybody else, including my own family. Though I want to flag that I am now updating the second part of that definition to shout out the family members who watch this show. So thank you to all of you. I was corrected on that last week. We have a lot of political scientists in my family, and our next Thanksgiving is going to be a weird one. Cool. Well, thank you all for being here. Today's topic, I am super excited about it. As I said, it's a very special topic for Independence Day. We are busting myths about democracy. So things you think you know about democracy, things you thought were true, maybe some things you learned in school, we are going to learn that they are all wrong. Our guests today are completely awesome, and I'm going to introduce them in mere moments. Once we get into our interview, here is what to expect. We are going to talk about myths surrounding the origins of democracy and the centrality of elections to democracy. We're going to talk about the relationship between technology and democracy. Is better technology, are technological advances good for democracy or not? And finally, less myth busting and more answering the question that's on everybody's mind every waking and sleeping moment. Is democracy dying? And especially right here in the good old US of A. So those are our big questions that will shape our hour together. I am here now going to introduce our guests. Our first guest today is David Stasavage. He can be found at Stasavage.com and at Stasavage on Twitter. He is at NYU. So he is a colleague of mine, but you will also notice from his title, the Dean of Social Sciences, he is, I don't know the exact, but he's basically my boss's boss with a lot more bosses in there. So I better not fuck this one up. So David is the Dean of Social Sciences at New York University, and he is the Julia Silver Professor of Politics, and he is an affiliated faculty member at the Law School and the Department of History. And those of you who saw last week's show know this is a very big deal. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Please join me in welcoming David to the show. Here he comes, coming on now. What's up, David? How are you?
Hello, Andrea. Thank you, and happy Independence Day.
Thank you very much. Happy Independence Day to you. How are you celebrating this year?
I think we're going to be trying to make hot dogs indoors that feel as if they were grilled outdoors. That's like the
nice.
best. If I get under these conditions, I think I'm going to count that as a win, basically. If that's as far as we get, yeah.
That's a huge win. So far, I have celebrated by shaking my fist and complaining every time fireworks go off in New York City.
Yes.
You're in New York City as well, is that right?
Yes. More. Yeah, I haven't been that many in this neighborhood, but it's clear that like instead of having the big show, they're just having a show every night, so we can enjoy it. That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and by they it means I think the city and Macy's is spreading it out so that we're not all crowding around. And I would also add to the they the people who live across the street from me. Those are the two big groups.
Yes. Yeah. The mystery fireworks. Yeah. No. I totally get it.
Yes. So David, I have known you for a long time, but many of our audience have not. So I'm going to give a somewhat creepy internet stalkery introduction to the folks at home about you beyond the titles that we've just gone through. Does that sound okay?
Sounds good.
Excellent. One day a guest is going to be like, no fucking way. And I'll have to change everything. All right. So we're going to do it. So here we are. So David plays a lot of roles at New York University, basically keeps us all going. He is also the author of the just published book. I think, David, the pub date was June 2nd, like a month ago, right?
Correct. June 2nd.
June 2nd. It's called The Decline and Rise of Democracy, A Global History from Antiquity to Today. And this is the first time on Ask a Political Scientist I have had the actual book with me. I've talked about a lot of great books, but I actually have it. And in fact, I'm going to go straight to just me to say that we're going to take a detour right this second and have a look inside. I don't want to give it all away, but we're going to jump to page 257 to this chart here. Now, I know it's impossible to see, so I want to jump. I'm one step ahead of you, everyone. Don't worry. Here it comes. There it is. So this is a graph of the rise of modern democracy over time, and it comes from the Polity4 dataset, which those of you who saw our episode with Irfan Noordin from Georgetown know that the Polity4 is my favorite measure of democracy. David, I'm going to put you on the spot. What's going on here on figure 11.1 of page 257 of your book?
Well, this, if you get to thinking about what the future of the democracy is in the U.S., this figure provides an awful lot of perspective, because basically what this measure does is try to track the rise of modern democracy over the last 200 years or so. And what you can see, apart from a few temporary setbacks, it's a really steady rise up to the point where now, give or take something, more than half of the world's population is living in a democracy. And if you think about, what if the US tomorrow failed and was no longer a democracy and was just a straight up autocracy? That figure would go down slightly, but not all that much. It would look like a small blip. So it's a little bit like, Carl Sagan's pale blue dot picture, like we are all really small here. Don't think that what's happening in the US is what's happening worldwide.
Excellent. I love, goal number one of this show is to share the good news about the research in political science with the world. And two is to remind us all that the US is not that important, and maybe it doesn't matter that much in the scheme of things. So in this case, democracy goes down in the US. Democracy is perhaps doing well elsewhere, but we'll talk about that more.
That's right. There are people in Ghana today who say we have a very vibrant democracy. It's too bad things are going so poorly in the U.S. You guys were the ones 20 or 30 years ago were trying to teach us how to be Democrats, and it turns out we did it on our own. So
yes, the student is now the master.
Exactly.
Yes, fabulous. Well, we are going to dive into a lot from your book. It is an excellent book. You can all order it right this second, and if you actually go on the YouTube live stream right now, underneath where it has the description of the video, you can click it, and there is a link to David's website, Twitter, and also a link to buy the book. So David, you've written a couple of other books. I'm just going to focus on your second most recent one that came out in 2016, Taxing the Rich, a history of fiscal fairness in the United States and Europe. I think we could have a whole other show about your work on taxation. David's written a number of other papers, all kind of in the theme of taxing and the history of democracy. So origins of early democracy, wealth inequality and democracy, and how large are the political costs of fiscal austerity. There are a lot more on David's website that you can read. This is probably unfair to all of your research, David, but for folks at home curious about taxing the rich, what's the high-level story here in terms of your work on taxation?
Well, the takeaway point from this book really made no one happy at all, because our basic point was to say, I'd like to see the rich get taxed more heavily, but it actually only happens very rarely. And what the book did is march through a lot of evidence to show that just because inequality is going up, some people might like the rich to be taxed more heavily. But there's a lot of people who don't. And it's not just because democracy is corrupted or captured or something like that. There's a lot of people among the greater public who are not necessarily favorable to having higher tax rates. And we could, as you say, have an entire other show on this.
Yes.
But it's a little bit of a, if the decline and rise of democracy story is an optimistic one, from the point of view of those who would like to see the rich taxed more heavily, the conclusion of this book was a little bit more on the pessimistic side.
I see. All right. Well, I appreciate a balanced look of optimism and pessimism. Excellent. Well, we will have you back to bring everyone's spirits right back down. But hopefully, this one is something of an uplifting conversation. I also want to flag that literally just published in CNN is an opinion piece by you. COVID-19 has exposed the weakness of America's federal government. So you can hop over to, it's on CNN's Twitter, CNN's opinion Twitter, David's Twitter. What's the story here? This seems like a pretty pessimistic look at the world, or at America, I should say. Yeah,
I mean, what I try to do in this piece is to try to walk through the history of American democracy right from the beginning, and talk about, at least for free white people, it started off with a very good deal where things were decentralized and people were settled in scattered communities, and there was no real central control. And the story of American democracy ever since that has been trying to resist central control. And the problem is that ultimately it's useful to have a strong central state to do things so that nurses don't have to wear garbage bags instead of having proper PPE. And this is what the COVID crisis has really exposed, is the weakness of our federal government relative to some other governments around there in being able to do something about this pandemic.
Excellent. Well, excellent that you're making that point. Maybe not so excellent that our federal government is not helping us.
Yeah, this is a little bit more on the negative side.
More on the negative side. Yeah. Very well. I think the third theme of this show is, I swear there's a positive point at some point. But yes. Okay. So please do check that out. It's a fantastic piece and getting lots of attention right as we speak. Finally, before we bring on our comedian guest for tonight, David, I have a picture here of coffee because I never properly thanked you. And this is how I thank people. I bring them on my show and make everyone I know watch you on YouTube while I do it. I never properly thanked you. When I was interviewing for a faculty position at NYU Shanghai, I spent a day and a half at the NYU office doing a job talk, which is basically giving a presentation on my research. And then you do like a litany of interviews, like a half hour with every faculty member. For those who don't know, the job talk experience in academia, it's a whole day. It's very intense. You were the only person in like a 15-hour day who offered me coffee, and it came mid-afternoon, and it totally saved my life. And to this day, when I'm like craving coffee, I think about the coffee in your office because it turned things around for me in a big way. Now, for those at home, it did not have little beans. That's just what all stock photos on the internet have. So you didn't give me coffee beans. But
it was more like a departmental what we could do kind of coffee.
Yeah. But it was, the circumstances were such, it was among the greatest cups of coffee I've ever had in my whole life. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. All right. So that is David. David, why don't we bring on our second guest for tonight? Sound good?
Sounds good.
Excellent. So our second guest is named Stu Evil. He is a stand-up comedian and a photographer. You can follow him on Instagram at Stu Evil. He performs all over New York City, including many venues, such as The Stand, the Broadway Comedy Club, and the world-famous Lantern Comedy Club. And if you watched last week's show, you know that the Lantern Comedy Club is where all up-and-coming comedians got their start. All right. Please welcome to the show, Stewie. How are you?
Hey, how are you, Andrew?
Hey, Stewie. How you doing?
Good.
Good to be with you.
How's life?
Life is all right. Just trying to, create some normalcy, so to speak, in my world right now. It's hard.
Yeah, that's a tall order. How is it going? Are you approaching normal?
No, because every time you think you're normal, you see something else, and you're like,
Yeah, 100%. And you are also in New York City, is that right?
Yes, I'm in New York City.
Cool. I think this is the first show where we've got all guests right here in New York City. So,
nice.
So fabulous. All right, Stewie. So I have a creepy intro for you. Are you ready for a mild version of This Is Your Recent Life?
Let's see it.
Hell yes. All right, here we go. So Stewie performs all over the city. He's amazing. He's super funny. We've spent many, I would say Friday and Saturday night, but also some pretty sad weeknights at the Lantern. Sad and charming, I would say. David, have you been to the Lantern? It's a comedy club right by Washington Square Park in NYU.
I have not actually. Once they made me a dean, they said I had to just be really serious.
Yeah.
So I think there was a whole list of things that I could no longer do. Like I can't swear on live shows. I can't,
Yeah.
No F-bombs, no comedy, no anything. So
right.
Yeah. But one day.
I like the idea, and I'm just going to operate under this assumption that when you become a dean, literally it's written in the contract, the Lantern Comedy Club is off limits. Like I hope that specifically was named. No $5 frozen margaritas for you. Very good. Well, when you're tired of being dean, you're welcome to come back on the show and just let the F-bombs fly at any time. That is
sounds good.
Yeah, very good. All right, so Stewie is a super funny comedian. He is amazing. He is the creator and producer of all kinds of comedy shows and showcases and comedy content. One of them is the Six Pack at Brit Pack Comedy Showcase, which until the whole city shut down, used to do shows that were awesome, killer lineups all the time. Stewie, what's the status of the Brit Pack these days?
It's on hiatus, like most of the
everything else.
Like everything else, yeah, it's on hiatus right now. It was a unique show because we had control of the room, so it's like open bar. So it's like we can't really bring that show via Zoom. So right now it's on hiatus, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Open bar via Zoom is drink whatever you have in your kitchen while you watch. Zoom. Yeah. Have you been able to do much Zoom or Instagram or whatever type comedy?
I've done a few Zoom shows. Yeah. I've done a few. Some, they're hit or miss. At the beginning, they were rough because everybody was trying to figure out, the whole thing. Yeah. It sucks when you bomb on Zoom if people are live because you just see everybody just staring at you.
Yeah. At least in comedy, it's a dark room.
Right, it's dark. You don't see the reactions as much. In Zoom, you see everyone. Okay.
That is very true. You are also one of the creators of Unusual Culprits, which has done some stuff online since we all went inside. What's going on with Unusual Culprits? And folks watching, you can find a link to Unusual Culprits under the video as well.
Yeah, so it's sort of we make sketch videos. We also produce comedy shows all over the city. Right now we're just writing. Hopefully when things start opening up, we can start creating more content. Yeah. It's just hard right now for my team to meet up.
Indeed. Yes, indeed. Indeed. And you are also, among many of the other comedy things that you've done and contributed to the city, is Se Habla Spanish, which is a Spanish-speaking stand-up comedy open mic, Spanish language open mic. Is that correct?
Yeah. We created that a scene before COVID was like bubbling of the Spanish comedy scene. So I created an open mic so comedians that are Spanish speakers can try their material, and we can get better and produce better shows and keep this Spanish comedy thing going.
How is it for you? Do you prefer to do stand up in Spanish or English?
They're a little different. There's more stories that I can tell in Spanish because people that speak Spanish are going to get them. Whereas if I do them in English, there's a little bit of less of a connection. So it's different. As of right now, I prefer to do it in English because that's where I guess I build my skills a little bit more. The Spanish comedy thing, it's just starting to bubble.
Cool. Yeah, I when you started it, I was like, oh, I should go to that and practice my Spanish. And then I was like, you know what? Nobody needs that. Nobody wants me to do that, and it's not for me. David, do you prefer to do comedy in Spanish or English? What do you think?
Oh, I would think definitely English or French, probably my Spanish. I can count. I'd have to go back to the old Sesame Street episodes from the early 70s. I probably knew more Spanish then when I was 5 years old than I do today, actually.
I see.
Yeah, sadly. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I will make you do some comedy in French at the end after you're done being dean. Well, that'll be part of our to-do list afterwards. All right. So Stewie is a multi-talented person. He is not just a comedian. He is also a photographer. And you can find some of his work at Stewie V Photos, as well as Comedians of NY, which documents comedians all over New York City. And here's me just picking out some of my favorite comedians, including one of my favorite shows that used to be at the Lantern called what is it called? Not a Therapist. Not a Therapist, where comedians give life advice that they're unqualified to give. And it's run by our friend Sarah Garner. And then finally, Stewie, so what are the things that you are doing? I don't have images for these, but what do you do when you are not doing comedy or taking photographs?
I'm also, like you, I'm involved a little bit in education. I'm also a teaching artist in after-school programs.
Awesome. What kind of programs?
It's like drama, theater. They are kind of social justice nonprofits.
Cool.
And then we use drama and theater to empower kids in the inner city.
Has that been moved online, or is that kind of
yeah, we had like a hiatus of about 2 weeks, and then we picked up and we did it virtually, and it actually it worked.
Awesome, fantastic, cool. Well, that is Stewie. You can follow him and all his goings on. He is amazing, and please check out his shows when they come back to life. Finally, every week, this is a free show, but we do like to raise money for good causes. So if you are able to donate or so inclined, maybe the price of a ticket, and you're allowed to guess whatever, are you attending a Broadway show or a free comedy show at the Lantern? Who's to say? You can donate to my PayPal. It is, or the Ask a Political Scientist PayPal. It is right here. And all donations this week are going to the Xavier Mission, which is an organization that operates right here in New York City, and it offers the community all kinds of things, including financial assistance, a food pantry, shelter, counseling, and gently used and or new professional clothing for folks for things like job interviews and that sort of thing. So all donations to the show this week are going straight to the Xavier Mission. So if you are able to donate, that would be fantastic. All right. Let us dive into our topics. We are here to unpack and bust some myths about the origins of democracy and the centrality of elections, technology and democracy, and the future. So here we are. So David, I'm going to turn to you to kick us off with some wisdom. Help us understand the origins of democracy. Where did it come from? How do we have it?
So there's the version we learn in school, which is that democracy was invented by the Greeks, and then it died out in Greece and eventually spread to Renaissance Italy. Then you can talk about things like Magna Carta in England, and you can talk about representative assemblies in Europe, and then you can eventually talk about democracy in America. And that's a nice story, but it really glosses over a lot. And the problem is that the Greeks invented the word democracy, but they didn't invent the practice. A lot of different human societies in pre-colonial Africa, in the Americas before European conquest, in South Asia, wherever you might find humans, practiced a form of democracy. And let me just unpack that idea. So the Greeks invented this idea of demokratia, as they call it, which meant that the demos, the people, had kratos, which is power. So at its root, all that democracy means is that the people have power. Now, they didn't say anything about there having to be elections every 4 years. They didn't see anything about there having to be political parties. It just meant that the people would have power. And so what Europeans started discovering as they went out and conquered other societies, they discovered a lot of these societies actually had practices that were pretty democratic, pretty more democratic than their own. Rulers ruled together with councils or assemblies. There was no coercive state. And this is something that prevailed so frequently that I'm prepared to say that democracy is a human invention. It's not a Greek invention, and it's not a European one specifically.
Ooh. So does it fall into the conversations around language, which is it sort of came from humans and they're universal? It takes slightly different forms all over the world, but it's something that sort of bubbles up from our brains and societies.
Yeah, I think that means it's not an inevitable thing, but it's a natural tendency for humans to govern themselves in this way. It's not always going to happen that way.
Right. Interesting. Stewie, how does this jive with the democracy history you learned in school?
I never knew this or heard this. That's why I'm like, oh.
Yeah, I definitely as well. It was Greeks.
Right. Yeah, I would have thought, the Greeks. But yeah, it's interesting to hear that it's a human invention. I bet most people would probably not be aware of that,
So David, how do you define democracy? So we've talked on this show in the past about democracy, and we often tend to tread in the space of elections, right? And so how would you decide if a country or one of these early societies is democratic? Is a council enough to count as a democracy, or what's the criteria?
Yeah, elections are critical for modern democracy. That's one manifestation of democracy that we've had for about 250 years, where we go to the polls every few years, we elect representatives. Representatives are the ones who govern on a daily basis. That's a particular form of democracy. But that's very recent compared to the thousands of years for which earlier forms of democracy were practiced. And the way I describe those earlier forms of democracy is that you might have had a leader who was inheriting their role, who wasn't elected, or there might have been some consensual means of appointing them, but there certainly wasn't an election. But they didn't have much power on their own. They didn't have subordinates. They didn't have a bureaucracy. They had to rule through the people, and ruling through the people meant ruling with the people, asking the people for information, asking the people for advice, getting their counsel. And so that's what I call a version of early democracy. And so it leads you to this odd conclusion that if you believe what I say about early democracy, then it's true that basically most democracies have never had an election.
Right. If the U.S. got rid of its election and replaced it with some kind of council, would that count, or we throw that away as we get to modern?
Well, then that's the tricky part, is that a lot of the great majority of these early democracies were really small scale affairs. This was like a face-to-face thing, in the level of one community or maybe several communities strung together. At times it got scaled up to larger areas. If you want to think about the Huron in Canada or the Iroquois Confederacy. But on the whole, early democracy was a small scale, everyday phenomenon where people were interacting face-to-face in assemblies or councils. And so if you think about what happens over a really large country, then that's no longer practical. And so, if we just did away with all the instruments of democracy in the US today, we wouldn't revert to having some sort of early democracy. That might happen at the level of individual towns. Think about the New England town meeting as kind of like a version of early democracy. But it wouldn't happen at the federal or even the state level.
Okay. So is there a way to, would it be better or more democratic to get those back? Or you think elections are fine for a large scale democracy?
Well, I mean, elections are what we got, basically, as the best technology for dealing with democracy on a large scale. But I think people have to recognize, and this is one of the things I try to say in the book, that modern democracy has very, very broad participation. And the great thing about this is that eventually, this started out as being broad participation only for free white males. But over time, it gets expanded as women demand the right to vote, as African Americans demand the right to vote. Modern democracy is a very broad principle where basically everybody should be able to participate. And those marginalized groups in society have mobilized over time to say, hey, this means us too. But the thing about elections is that most people, the only time they ever participate politically is every few years. And so that's a form of participation that's very broad, but it's not a form of participation that's very deep. And it could lead to people becoming dissatisfied and saying, well, I don't really have a role here if I'm just, pulling a ballot lever every few years.
Right. And then even then getting jaded about never getting your candidate or popular vote versus electoral vote in the case of the national or the idea that no matter who you vote for, the system is all messed up no matter what.
Precisely.
Right. Stewie, I'm curious, are you particularly politically involved? I
am not. And it's even more difficult today because which is going to lead me to ask a question to David, because I guess in the past you had usually the people on the left, people on the right, and you'd have your discussions or disagreements of what you don't believe, and you'd scream, fuck you, your candidate, your can. But you could all right, we'll have a beer after. We're still friends or family. And now it just feels like it just keeps going more extreme across, and then you're so far away. You shout, this person's not gonna hear it. This person shouts, and yeah, that's why, because I'm somebody who's more in the middle. I look at both sides to understand what is the best solution. It shouldn't be just one. We just listen to one party. But then doing that or having an opinion like that does get you sometimes in hot water with people, because everybody is so extreme. It's either you're a snowflake, or you're just lazy, you just want everything free, or you're just racist, blah blah blah. Yep. So I don't know, David, just a curiosity, do you see this changing anytime soon, this big political division that we have? Do we get over it, or is just going to get worse? Because right now we're so many tensions are boiling, and we're in the middle of an election coming up again, and those tensions I think are going to resurface again.
No, I know what you're saying exactly. And it just feels like the volume keeps getting turned up louder and louder and louder. We started off, we were at 10, now we're at 11, and then who knows where we'll be. And the thing about that is it's not just a phenomenon of 2016, although obviously that made things a lot worse, and that we have a particular, one of the most divisive presidents in U.S. history. But it's a phenomenon that's been building for a long time, I think, the degree of polarization between different groups. And I think it's ultimately intimately linked to distrust. Distrust of the federal government, which we've seen just plummet over the decades. And that comes back to this element I'm saying, that people feel very, very disconnected from the federal government. They're not very trusting of it. They don't feel like they can influence it. They vote only every few years. A lot of the earlier sort of more community-based mechanisms for political participation that used to be common have sort of withered away in a lot of cases. The parties used to be stronger at the local level, and that's less important. And so I think that sort of feeds into that spirit of division that you're talking about, because I think people go off in different directions when they're distrustful and they don't really have the information they need.
So I actually want to add to Stewie's question and fold it back into your historical perspective. I mean, is this polarization or democracy as power of the people sounds awesome. Democracy as people who disagree screaming at each other at a high volume and not listening to one another is super frustrating. Historically, did you find in your work other cases of countries kind of splitting apart the way that we're observing in the U.S.? Is polarization something that's happened elsewhere? Is it particular types of democracies or two-party systems, or is it a modern thing?
It happens all the time. It's odd. Sometimes it happens in this stark geographic way that we've seen. Sometimes it happens by class, but it's actually happened a lot in the U.S. before. I mean, even not only for the Civil War, that's the most obvious case, but a lot of other times we've really been pretty starkly polarized. And so one of the things about American democracy is a lot of us tend to think, well, this period between, say, 1945 and 1980, 1990, where the Democratic and Republican parties weren't so different, was the norm. In fact, it's actually pretty atypical for what we've seen in American democracy. And that comes back to this question of, we're a very large democracy. We're very extensive. if we had a, like the group of states that Cuomo was trying to put together in April of New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, we had the Republic of New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and I guess it was Rhode Island too.
Is this an argument for secession? You heard it here first, folks.
I'm not allowed to talk about that as a dean either. So that's
quite the list.
We'd have a much different story. Just as if there was an independent republic of Wyoming and the Dakotas and Montana, things would be different there too.
So I want to pause and acknowledge folks are asking questions in the chat. Thank you so much for that, and keep your questions coming. If I am looking away, it's not that I'm not paying attention. It's that I'm folding in here. And we actually have a question already that I think builds right on this from Peter Gisella, who wants to know, does democracy without universal critical thinking education work in the long run of human history?
Well, that's one of the critical things, actually, that you need to maintain a large democracy. Is if people feel really disconnected, then using education so that people actually know how the government functions, and so they feel like they have the means to influence government, can be really, really critical. And I think we've lost a little bit of sight of that. I actually talked about this at the very end of my CNN opinion piece that you mentioned, where if you go back to the early republic after the founding, the people in the 1810s and the 1820s didn't sit around saying, "Oh, this is fabulous. We got this wonderful Constitution. We have the Federalist Papers where Madison and the others said this is going to work fantastically." They were actually really scared. They said it's rare to have such a large republic. How on earth is this thing going to survive? And so they decided to say, well, we need to educate people. We need to have free schooling, or at least low-cost schooling for everybody. That would be supported by state governments. And so you get this thing called the Common School movement that I think was actually very important for cementing the early status of American democracy. And maybe it's time to go back to thinking in that way. And that, of course, state governments have gutted education budgets across the country in so many ways. Maybe that wasn't such a good idea. So I don't know if that's exactly what the questioner had in mind, but that's my response to what I perceive in that.
Yeah. Well, if only there were some educators on this show who could somehow do some educating. I think we should. I'm like, oh, maybe I should fold some government into my teaching. Stewie, do you fold anything in sort of the civics or citizenship or government or anything in your programs and your teaching?
We don't. Sometimes topics do come up, the students, and we kind of open it and have discussions with them about how they feel, but it's not something like we come in to try, Yeah, our programs are more arts-based, but if the students need to have that conversation, we definitely open it up to them and, sometimes have discussions.
Yeah, and if I just add on that is if there's going to be a renewed emphasis on citizenship and civics, some people on the political right seem to think, oh, that means we go back to the 1950s and a lot of the citizens. But if you look at the citizenship discussions in the in the 50s, and you pry things away, well, women weren't really being included in this as real actors. Certainly African Americans were not being included in real actors. Other immigrant groups were not being. This was for white guys basically to say, oh, this is how to learn citizenship and this is how to behave. And so we'd really have to have some agreement on what does civics mean today in today's world, and how it should be different.
Well, and getting that agreement sounds like it goes right back to what Stewie pointed out, which is a nightmare to figure out what the agreement is on what we teach, right?
But though, if you think of the recent protests, right, how many people in how many different places protested peacefully after the murder of George Floyd, I think that's really something. I mean, my kids are 12 and 17, and they were out there, and they are way more politically aware and engaged than certainly I was at their age in the early 1980s. So maybe that's a good thing. Yeah. All right. There's some hope. For Stewie. Do you find your students are politically engaged in a way that
I haven't, because this in previous semesters not so much. I think when the election of 2016 we did have a discussion. Virtually, the whole the George Floyd incident happened after my programs had already finished. But I'm sure if it would have happened, we would have had a discussion, and I'm sure. But we did have like a group chat on WhatsApp, and we do still talk, and we were talking. Some of them were protesting, some of them were trying to be more active. So that is a good sign that so many people did come together to like trying to make change or work towards change. And some of them were putting like organizations that you can donate to. So that was kind of like, cute and cool.
Yeah.
That they were like, trying to take, trying to be active.
Yeah, and coming back to the Greek definition of democracy, that's just another illustration of the people trying to have power, right? That is whole and part of the thing, and that's what fills in the gaps in between elections when people have other means of expressing their voice, as they did.
Yeah, so that actually segues perfectly to our next topic, which is technology, and it's a second level segue because Ito, I know, brace yourselves, it's segues upon segues. Ito Steinberg in the chat has asked a question that's exactly where I wanted to go. So Ito is asking, can technology lead to a return of sorts to direct democracy on a larger scale, or will only activists and the rich take advantage of such a system?
Well, yeah, and that's an interesting thing. If I had written my book 10 or 15 years ago, I probably would have been a lot more optimistic about the internet and say, oh, this is going to allow people to connect.
I think we were all a lot more optimistic about the internet.
Yeah, no, exactly. Luckily, I wrote it in 2020 and not 2010. But technology over history has really cut two ways, right? In a lot of early societies, it was the Chinese that were way in advance of Europeans, and the Chinese state had these mechanisms for knowing what people were producing and what they were doing, because they had like much better understanding of the soil, for example. So they could say if someone was trying to tax me, we know what kind of soil you'll have on your land. We're going to tax you according to that. We don't need to ask you anything in a council or an assembly about what you can pay or what would be right for you to pay. We just know what you can pay and we take it. Europeans were way behind with regard to technologies like that. And it's one of the reasons why, precisely because Europe was backward and its rulers had little power, they had to rule together with the people. Why you get modern democracy emerging in Europe and not elsewhere. Now, there are cases, of course, where technology has helped people to connect in a lower cost means and facilitated communication. One of the great examples there is the transition from non-alphabetic to alphabetic forms of writing has seemed to be associated with democracy because more people had access to it. So
in that it's easier to read? Easier
to read, easier to learn. Yeah, exactly. Think about trying to learn 50,000 Chinese characters versus 26 letters. There's a little bit of I
tried, and English was easier, though I did start with English.
There's a little bit of a difference there, right? Exactly. And so if you come back to thinking about, we have the tools now to connect people with their representatives much more frequently than before. It's just, it hasn't happened yet that we've hit a model that people really feel satisfied with it. And that's, I don't know, it could be that we just haven't found the right model yet. Or it could be that there's something inherent to online communication like that does not give people the same feeling of participation as you would have if it was actual real life communication with someone standing there in front of you.
Right. Which, as you're saying it, the importance of real life.
Exactly.
Yeah. I was like, that would be nice. Teaching in person, comedy in person. Yeah.
Everybody's learned a lot more. I mean, I my meditation classes now. I learned that I can just do the really relaxed studio in California, and it's online instead of the place around the corner that costs 3 times as much and closed down, and it seems just as good. So maybe we're learning things, and maybe that would apply to a modern form of democracy, and even a direct form of democracy, as the questioner is referring to.
And what would that model? I mean, do you have an idea of what that model would look like that would make direct democracy easier? I mean,
well, yeah. So there are some ideas out there. People have all sorts of ideas, right? Sure. And it's generally people who are not actually in government, and just your professors like myself sitting around saying, what if we did this? Right. And so one of the ideas is to have these sort of random citizen panels, have like 300 people selected randomly that then discuss and decide on a question.
That sounds hard.
It's kind of scary. Yeah, exactly. I mean, exactly. Would you say, let's find 300 random Americans, select them and see what happens? That's a little bit of an uncertain proposition. So maybe, I think, again, it's very, very early days in terms of thinking about, just remember, everything seems faster these days, but modern democracy took a long time for the institutions to be designed and for people to think about how it was actually going to work. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we get a better version via online communication, but it might take several decades for people to sort of figure out exactly how this would work in a way that that everyone would be comfortable with.
Right, and that isn't just us reacting to politicians' tweets and freaking out, which doesn't quite feel like the spirit of power of the people. That
no, it doesn't. It doesn't make us feel empowered at all.
Yeah. So Stewie, are you online? Are you someone who signs like the petitions and retweets political stuff? Are you?
I don't retweet too much stuff because it's you always end up in this rabbit hole where you're like, the tweet leads to something else, and then at some point you're like, oh my god, there are so many stupid people out there. Like, I just can't believe that these, this is somebody sitting down like writing these things. And then and then I feel bad about myself, and I'm like,
no, it's a medium that brings out the worst in people.
Oh it does.
Oh, yeah. I honestly, I would go off of Twitter if I didn't want to try to get more people to watch this show. I feel like it's like pretty much what I do on there at this point, which cool. So well, let's take the broad picture, David. So technology, meaning the internet, is only the case as of the last 2 decades, or I'm outing myself as not knowing when the internet started, right? But what about technology and democracy from the beginning of all of this? You mentioned that having an alphabet that was easy to learn was helpful for democracy, and I guess you could put that under the category of technology to a sense. Like over the long haul, has technology been helpful for democracy once we figure it out? Is there hope for us?
I think there's hope for us, but I think in many cases it's been harmful, but it's been dependent on really the nature of the technology. So contrast the example of the alphabet that gave everybody, not everybody, but more people access to writing, with a lot of earlier forms of script that were really just used by those in the know. And so, for example, the Incas in Peru, they had no writing as we would understand it, but they had this incredibly complicated thing called the quipu, which is a series of strings with knots of different colors, and that they can record immense amount of information on it. But it was so complicated that it was really only bureaucrats who had this position called the keeper of the knots, who understood how the thing worked. And so that's a society where the information is all bottled up inside a state elite, and where it's not getting out. And if that's the case, then that's certainly not very helpful for democracy. Right.
Is a world where everyone, the WikiLeaks team, right? Like, it's a world where everyone has access to information. We declassify a whole bunch of stuff. Is that better for democracy?
Yeah, I guess it depends upon what the alternative is. So if you come back again to the early republic, one of the other things they did at that time was they subsidized newspaper delivery, because a lot of people didn't have much information at all about government. And so they said, okay, you can get a newspaper delivered anywhere in the 13 states for 1 penny. And the effect of that was to give people more information about how their government was working. But that was going from sort of no information to some information. What we have today is people already had some information. But as you get this correspondingly larger amount of outlets, from ever more cable channels to ever more social media concepts and so on, we're all drowning in information, but we get to a point where more information is not necessarily better, because as you get more of it, the quality of the individual bits of information seems to get devalued and no longer very useful at all.
And I am thinking back to what you said, which is very impressive, about how you try to pay attention to both sides, because that is not easy to do, and probably requires twice as much work as the rest of us who pick a side and focus on it. I mean, do you find, Stewie, that both sides, are there any commonalities? Like, how much is the media playing a role in making our conversations about government and democracy worse?
I think they take advantage of the fact that the tensions are so high, and it almost, I guess, gives them more leeway as far as journalists to not be as objective now. They can just, almost say anything, and you can almost even invent anything. And as long as it goes with what that site, they'll actually believe it. You don't have to have facts. You can just say something. And going opposed to that, you can come with facts. Like, for example, David can present something. He could have factual all the data. These are the statistics. These were the tests done over 200. And people would be like, no, I don't know, because that's this, that. And it was going to lead me to another question. So how do you feel? Because I feel like there is a lot of distrust, and It's like all these, everybody's speaking loud, not only like from parties, but also the media. And I think from both sides, we've seen that they can be very biased, or that they are presenting things that are sometimes not even real, or it's not, there's no fact check. Because you throw the information out there, people will believe it. And, you know, there's very little times where there's a retraction from what you said, or people already forgot. They don't even pay attention to that. It's just like,
yeah, because the news cycle works so quickly that's all there is. Now, the thing about trust that's really interesting is that trust in the federal government is at an all-time low. Trust in state and local governments is kind of as high as it's ever been. It's really fascinating. Even state governments that are generally not that functional, according to some sort of objective criteria, people just have a lot more trust in their state. We see, if you ask people, do you trust your state government, or do you trust your local government? People like 50 to 60% of people will say yes.
Is that a COVID thing, or this is the last many years?
No, it's more recent. Sorry, I mean, no, it actually goes back. No, it goes back decades is what I mean.
More recent than COVID,
No, it goes back decades. And whereas trust in the federal government is like 15%. So there's been a huge, huge change over time with that.
To what do you attribute that higher trust in local government?
I think it comes back to this point again. Democracy is much easier to make work as a local phenomenon. And it's always trust. It's difficult to make that work in much larger scale entities like the United States. That doesn't mean, we should split off and have the Republic of Connecticut, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and New York. But it does mean that we've got to think about how to connect people with the federal government that they see as being very distant.
And this actually brings me to another question from our audience. Thank you all for your great questions. This one comes from Don Rushman. Are there any other present democracies that have as convoluted a system of representation, whether it's the states or the Electoral College, et cetera, as the United States? Are we the most complicated?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was said with some feeling. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, just the sheer oddity of the Electoral College and this effect that it means you're only going to campaign heavily in a very narrow series of swing states, and even within those states, only in a certain number of counties. Is absolutely bizarre. And it's part of this relic where the founders set things up. The founders were actually very worried about the people. They would worry that the people would do things like say, we need abolition of debts, we need more paper money. And so they established all these checks, 6-year term for senators. The Electoral College, which originally the electors could vote the way they pleased. And these were all meant to be ways to basically prevent the people from exercising democracy too directly. And the problem is, bit by bit, those things got unwound. So we now have direct election of senators, which is what we didn't have in the Constitution originally, but they still have 6-year terms. We no longer have a situation where you vote for an elector who does what they want. The elector is bound, but they didn't get away with the Electoral College. We still have this situation where there's this weird disparity, which makes it necessary to go focus on a few states. So I think I would say that, maybe there are some countries out there that have a system that's equally bizarre, but we're definitely, if we're not at the head of the pack, we're near the head of the pack.
Nice. So I want to get to our final big point in our outline, just to make sure that we hit it. How is democracy in the United States dying?
And the way I'd answer that, I'd come back to what we mean by democracy dying. So I would predict, and perhaps, I don't know, I could be wrong in 5 months' time, right? That we'll
re-up this video with you.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we'll have to, but I suspect we're going to keep having elections. I suspect we're going to have a Democratic Party and a Republican Party. And so if you think of it on a very narrow grounds, that would mean, we're still a democracy. But the real question, if you go back to the original Greek definition, are the people themselves, do they have power? Are they participating in governance on a regular basis? That's the way things may be eroding. Josh Ober, who's a famous classicist at Stanford, has this article he wrote where he said, basically, and he's the guy who knows basically more about the politics of Athens than anybody on Earth. And Josh said, well, the Athenians, if they were here today, probably wouldn't think we had a democracy. What was this with this weird system where you only get to participate every few years and that's kind of it otherwise? So if I see democracy withering away in the United States. It's going to wither away for the reasons I've been talking about the levels of distrust in government, about the absence of participation, all of which open the door for a narrow corporate or wealthy interest to control the show.
I mean, I don't know, Stewie, I'm curious your perspective. I mean, to me, it seems like the wealthy and the corporate interests do control the show. I say this as a citizen, not as a political scientist. I have nothing to back this up, but that's the sort of the headlines that I see.
That's what it feels like. It almost feels like we're going like during these election periods that you read about from like 1920s, where like intimidation was used as a form to keep a certain person from. And it was like people at the top that kind of had a lot of control over how these elections went. And it feels like we're almost like getting to that, right? Like we have one party can try to intimidate another, but it's feeling that way. And then like Andrew said, yeah, it's starting to feel like, people at the top is. I mean, and you have one party that is actively trying to de facto disenfranchise people in any way they can. They had the great thing in North Carolina where the churches would go out and had this thing called Souls to the Polls, where they would say, okay, now we're going to go vote after church. And there's some reason the state government controlled by Republicans figured out, well, no, we're going to figure out a weird way of outlawing that. I don't know how they did it exactly, but it was so there's just all kinds of stuff like that going on. And the vote by mail issue is another big one, of course, where they're trying to take away that as a possibility, even though the evidence doesn't suggest that voting by mail necessarily favors Republicans or Democrats. But there's people who are scared of that possibility.
So, David, that I'm glad you brought up the voting by mail, because you have a piece and you've been thinking a lot about voting by mail and governments being for or against it. What is the historical view on voting by mail? Yeah,
well, I've tentatively titled the piece it's coming out with Project Syndicate next week, and I've tentatively titled it "Opposition to Voting by Mail is 600 years old." And who knows what they may call it, something different. They may say that doesn't make sense, but the idea in there is that if you go back over 600 years to some of the earliest laws restricting the suffrage that happened in England in 1429, where they said that to be able to vote, anybody has to have land that brought an annual return of 40 shillings, which is a fair bit at the time. So it meant that only about 3% of people could vote. That people who advocate those suffrage restrictions have always said that they're trying to do that to defend the integrity of the electoral system. So it was the same thing in 1429. It was the same thing in the 19th century when people tried to pass the secret ballot. It's the same thing with opposition to voting by mail today, where people say, oh, no, we want everybody to participate. The real thing that we're worried about, supposedly, is the integrity of the electoral system, that somehow voting by mail is cheaper, more subject to fraud, more subject to problems than would be the case with voting in person.
So are either of you fans of the Netflix show Dark? And I swear this is related to where we're going. I'm not just like, oh my God, I can't take it. We're talking about Netflix. You know the show? It's a German show about time travel.
I do not know it.
Okay, well, this has failed. But if anyone in the chat knows it, where I'm going with this is basically they just walk around. This isn't a spoiler, I don't think. They basically just walk around talking about how much history just keeps repeating itself, which I guess is not unique to that show, but it's a point that people make. I mean, this more than anything that we've talked about so far tonight, David, sounds so insanely like the same conversation over and over and over again.
Yeah, or that's a little bit, I'm a little bit older, so I think of it as the Battlestar Galactica thing, that phrase, all of this has happened before and all of this will happen again.
Yeah.
But it does.
Stewie, what's your pop culture reference on everything repeating itself?
Well, the more I read, the more I read, I go and keep looking back. And a lot of times I read and I find myself, it's almost like it's the same show. Different characters, they change the clothing, but you have a lot of the same characters. Like what this type of politician was, like you'll have it today. This type of person, and they all exist today. We just have different mediums with which to express ourselves. But it repeats itself. Yeah, it's almost uncanny.
It's the same strategies over time. That's right.
Yeah. Another question. Another one from Rushman, who's obsessed with U.S. exceptionalism. He's my uncle, so I can. Give him some grief, but he wants to know, is having the state majority party run elections uniquely weird to the U.S.? Having the state majority party run elections, is that a U.S. thing?
That is the state. You mean at the level of each state? Because of course it's the states that are running elections, and There are a lot of games played with redistricting in other countries, not nearly as many as in the U.S. I do think it is a weird thing in that a lot of countries would have an independent electoral commission. And this is
only occurring to me now that we don't have one.
Well, and of course, this is the thing. So when donor agencies like USAID went out in the 1990s and said, okay, you people in poor countries, you need to learn how to be a democracy, and you need something called an independent electoral commission, which is actually a really good idea. But of course, we never, it was sort of like do as we say, not as we do, because we never had anything, and we never have any. We have something like that for the presidential debates, right? The presidential debates are actually governed by an independent commission that has been quite effective, and probably one of the reasons why that still exists as an institution. But no, the idea of doing something like that in the U.S. just seems very unlikely.
So I don't know, Stu, are you? I'm not sure I'm optimistic yet. I
am not. I am on the pessimistic side. I see the whole thing burning down.
Bring us up. What's
the
hope.
The optimistic side comes back to that original graph that Andrea was showing.
Hey, I'm getting it out.
Yeah. Get it out again, just to before we go, to lift our spirits a little bit.
Okay, ready?
We're ready. So think about 1950 and why.
Good TV. Are we doing it? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, there we go.
I can see it.
Yeah.
If you think that the 1950s is just before you get that really huge jump there up.
This business, right?
Yeah, right around there. Right up there.
What's this? Wars and stuff?
That's that, right? Post-war, and it's also especially independence for a lot of countries post-World War II. And so what that means is that's a jump up when Europeans who had conquered societies that had earlier forms of democracy and then said, well, we're not happy with your early democracy, suddenly left town. And then these countries became democratic again, albeit in a new form of modern democracy. And so the huge jump there, it's really due to India. 1947, India is the world's largest democracy and has been a democracy ever since.
Right, and the y-axis for folks is populations living under democracy.
Yeah, percent of the world population. And so just think about that fact that there, after 1989, people, the wise political scientists of the time said, oh, there's no chance that African countries are really going to remain stable democracies. That's true of a lot of African countries, but it's not true of a lot of others, because there's, something between about a third of the continent's countries have stable democracies and very effective democracies right now. And I don't think that was unanticipated. So once again, looking beyond the U.S., even if there's been what we call backsliding, that's another political science-y term, meaning retreat from democracy in some countries, the overall trend remains upward. For the U.S., I think it's a little bit harder for me to summon the enthusiasm.
I was really counting on you, David.
But okay, I'm going to rely on things like how rapidly opinion shifted on gay marriage and how that influenced policy. I'm going to rely on the fact of how rapidly opinion has shifted on the subject of encounters between African Americans and the police. It was shifting before George Floyd, but then it shifted a ton more after that. And that when you really observe those shifts, when the popular opinion is really driving things, you see it's not just one party that shifts, it's both of them, right? So with gay marriage, it was suddenly Republicans were just said, okay, this is it. We accept it. That's, we've been opposing it for a long time. And the same thing, of course, is happening with police tactics now. We'll see if it sticks that way, right? It may not stick, but the shift in popular opinion is there. So I do think there are some issues in some cases where we see that. And I do think that also that the recent very peaceful protests have shown just that there's a lot of desire to participate and do something out there on broadly across this country. This was not just a movement led by a couple of core urban centers. It was really broad based, and that's pretty remarkable. So if you focus on that kind of stuff, I think that's important. The key question is how to translate it into this idea. We've been telling people, politicians have been telling people for the last 40 years that the government, quote, in Washington is the problem. And as long as you keep doing that, then people are not going to trust the government in Washington, but we need the government in Washington to be able to do things for us. And so you need to connect that sort of ground-based movement with getting them thinking, okay, we'd like to connect with with what's actually happening in Washington, so that we can know what's going on, so that we can influence what's going on, and so we'd be less distrustful of it.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that got you partway there, or a little
How
bit.
optimistic are you now, Stewie?
Just a little bit.
Yeah.
You know what? That is a monumental achievement in 2020 to have any optimism go up a tiny bit.
Yeah.
A question here from Ido, building right on this. Are there countries that are facing democratic backsliding that most Americans don't know about? So other places like Poland and Hungary. And I would also just asterisk to Ido, you have more optimism than I do about most Americans knowing about Poland and Hungary, but I'll set that I'll set that aside.
Yeah, that's right, because I don't think there was that great study of when there was talking about armed intervention in Ukraine and who supported it, and Americans who were less likely to actually know where Ukraine was were more favorable to it. So the fraction of people that can actually identify Poland or Hungary on a map is pretty low. So the fraction of people who know that there's backsliding going on there, which is really important, I think is also quite low. People in other European democracies would be much more familiar with that because they're right next door.
Yeah, but are there other examples of backsliding? I mean,
well, sure. And what's happened is in some countries, COVID-19 has provided the opportunity for backsliding because it's seen as an emergency. And the argument's been made by some rulers, well, if this is an emergency, what we need to do is have emergency powers. And so you get this story. Cambodia certainly wasn't a democracy going into COVID, but it's even less of one now because basically the premier, Hun Sen, has the power to control the media completely. And the idea was that supposedly that was to say that that's better to control news about COVID and make sure people do the right thing. But of course, there were ulterior motives of just being wanting to control things, period. Right. So there is other backsliding going on out there. Yes.
Right. And you actually are reminding me of, this is our 16th show, by the way. I planned on doing like 3 and we're still going. Wow. I'm very excited. Yeah. So just a little self-congratulation for me. But it reminds me of our 4th show where we had Shayna Gadarian and Bethany Alberts on to talk about the relationship between anxiety and politics. And one of the things that they found, and they did their research way pre-COVID, was that in times of great anxiety, voters are more permissive in democracies of governments expanding their power and basically taking on less democratic responsibilities. Like, yeah, we got to control the media because we're in a crisis, right? Emergency, declaring a state of emergency. And so voters can become more tolerant of that sort of thing.
Yeah, and that is a classic idea that's out there, that it's anxiety that leads to this sort of thing. I'm not sure that we know exactly why that is. It's always asserted, and it's not like, if I feel anxious someday, I don't wish for a strong leader to come in and tell me what to do necessarily.
The more anxious I get, the more I'm moving to China. So
yeah, no, exactly. So
as someone who was anxious and did move to China, there's actually some truth
there's definitely an empirical link out there that we see over time, that in times of anxiety, it's more likely to lead people to accept turning to people of a more authoritarian ilk. But there again, I'd remind people of that graph. The big picture over 200 years, pretty darn good.
That is pretty good. Do you see a world? We're going to wrap up in just a few minutes, and I want to get to our 2 final questions. One, end of history type stuff. Do you see the globe going to a place where we ultimately have all countries as democracies?
No, definitely not. Definitely not, because I think if you look 30 years ago and you look at what political scientists were saying 30 years ago, they had this idea that democracy was sort of the natural long-term evolution of things, and that as societies grow richer and more advanced and whatever, that people would demand democracy, and democracy would eventually emerge. And it was all taken from the European story. And what we see today, I don't think that really works that well, because we have alternative models, the autocratic models, that are incredibly stable. That China has been an autocracy for something like 4,000 years now. And it's that's a pretty good run, right?
Yeah,
that's a very stable system. And there are other strong autocracies out there. Not all autocracies are strong, of course, but that's an alternative model that works. It works in the sense of it's stable, it exists. Whether people are like it or not is a different question, and I'm not denigrating the Chinese model in any way, shape, or fashion, because the average citizen in China looks at the U.S. today and might think, I don't necessarily want to go that direction. But it's a stable one. It's a stable alternative in any case. So I think we really do have these two alternatives of autocracy and a democracy, and that are each stable in their own way and are likely to persist.
So Stewie, second to final question. You've done a lot of traveling. Have you been to a non-democratic country where you were like, yeah, I could live like this?
No, I don't. Have I? No, I think every country I visited has been a democratic country. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, so much for my pro-autocracy right turn in this show where I play the Chinese national anthem. I will say I lived in China for many years. I was there for NYU Shanghai, and there's a lot of problems with their system, of course, but it is very stable. And there is something nice about not being able to talk about politics, because you get into fewer screaming matches with just everyone. Like, you just can't talk about it, and it's just way less tense. Trade-offs are there, but I will shout that out. So last point, and we will bring this back to democracy, not autocracy. How we've talked about direct democracy, we've talked about power to the people having power. What are some things, David, that you've found in your research or ideas you have, and Stewie, I'm curious to hear your thoughts as well, that we citizens can do other than wait for the next election? Like, what are some of the more effective things that we can do to be more involved?
Well, I think mobilize. If it means getting in the street for peaceful protest, that's one thing. Yep. If it means forming groups that are interested in questions, political clubs to sort of study, think about politics, think about what's going on. If it means going to town halls held by your representatives, that's something. If it means educating your kids about how the system actually functions, then that's a helpful thing. There are a lot of things that people can be doing on the ground, but one of the big conclusions I want to arrive at from that, though, is that ultimately what's worked in the U.S. in the past, in the early republic, it wasn't just people on their own doing that. It was the government itself making investments to help people participate. It was the government itself investing in education so people could participate better. It was the government itself subsidizing the delivery of newspapers so that people could inform themselves and participate more effectively. And so ultimately we need, and this is going to sound like pie in the sky, and it basically is, but I'll say it anyway, some sort of a national strategy to think, like, what are the investments that could be made so that people feel like they're actually connected with and participating in government.
I will take that pie in the sky as a good goal. Stewie, what are your thoughts as far as participating in government? Things that you've done or that come to mind as we've talked about this?
Yeah, I mean, people have to become educated, and as David pointed out, that would be a good way. It's to make an investment towards that, because I think when, for example, somebody who's doesn't come from like a political side, right? When you hear politics, for a lot of people, it's like boring. They don't want to get into it because it's like somebody's gonna just. It's almost it's very right, and it's polarizing. It's like kind of like religion. Somebody's just gonna tell you the good parts because they want you to, join their religion. But I think, people need to be educated in how, how these things can affect them directly in their communities. And I mean, now people are starting, I guess, to be more aware of it, but it took like a lot of years, and it took this very ugly moment for people to like, oh, wait, let me look, right? So unless I think you have like, some investment of educating people, it's hard, because it's like most people don't want to, a lot of people don't want to deal with that. Like, I work, I got kids to feed. Right. I don't want to deal with that shit.
Yeah, and can I just add in there? That's the really key thing, is that if you go back to that original Greek definition of democracy that I keep harping on about, that is, the people having power, the people governing. Democracy is us. And if we're not doing anything, then that's what leads to the erosion of democracy. Whereas the alternative is exactly what Andrea was describing for China. You don't have to worry about politics on a daily basis. Someone else is going to decide for you. That's fine. They're just going to decide for you, and you don't need to worry, and that's okay. But if you're in a democracy, then democracy ultimately, it's us. And if we're not participating, then someone else will be. And they'll be deciding for us, and that's not something we particularly favor.
Right, and let me also say that it's pretty great. It's nice to not worry about it, but it's horrible the minute the policy doesn't help you, and often actually actively hurts you. So, of course, cool. All right, so we have kept both of you long enough. Thank you both so much for being here. I am taking away that I will do more to be more involved in in democracy here and doing more to get more people involved and maybe feel like it's less of a negative experience to think about politics generally. Where can folks find you? David, let's start with you. Where can folks find you, follow your writing and thinking and talking and all of that?
Anything I write, I put out on Twitter.
Okay. Twitter. And your Twitter, here it is. It's just your last name on Twitter.
Yeah, anything I write, I put out on Twitter. And so the voting by mail piece will be coming out next week. I'll be publishing, various other small snippets. Obviously, the book was the big thing. So if you want to find out what I'm writing, yes. take a look at the book. But anything I write, I do put out on Twitter. Excellent. And there's a link to buy the book on Twitter as well as under the description of this video. It is a fantastic book, much worth a read, and you too will leave more optimistic. Stewie, where can folks find you and keep up with your many goings on?
At Stu Evil, that's like the hub. And then under that profile on Instagram, I have links to all my other stuff. And just want to say thank you, David, and thank you, Andrew, for bringing me. This was a great discussion. Like Andrea, thank you, Stewie. I was very pessimistic. I still have the pessimism, but there's some optimism, or at least now I feel more inclined to do something about it or to educate other people who. Yeah, it seemed like we got about 25 to 30% of the way there towards optimism. Yeah. Yeah.
That's the biggest movement in the history of 2020. So I will take that. Well, thank you, Stewie, so much for spending time with us. Thank you, David, for sharing your research with us. Thank you all who have watched. Thank you all who have donated. If you still want to donate, you can. Donations go straight to the Xavier mission, supporting folks right here in our community in New York City. All amounts are welcome. All proceeds go straight to there. All right, that is it for our show. I'm Andrea Jones-Rooy, and I'm so grateful you have been here with us. We will see you next week, where we are talking about, with Jennifer Chudy from Wellesley, we are talking about white racial sympathy, guilt, and prejudice. Another cheerful topic. Please join us next week at 7 p.m. Thank you, and good night.
Good night. Thank you, everybody.